This is a presentation on the topic of incarnation, which again has a conventional Christian understanding, which I will allude to briefly in a moment. But I want to take on board the evolutionary challenges and perspectives of our time, which require us to broaden the meaning of that concept, that word, incarnation. In another PowerPoint presentation, in another YouTube, I talk about incarnation as being primarily embodied in the notion of the Great Spirit. And in this presentation, we are looking at the Christian context, but within an evolutionary perspective. So firstly, the conventional meaning is summarized in these 5 statements. Incarnation happened once and forever through the person of Jesus. God sent Jesus for one purpose only, to save sin-ridden humanity. This can only be accomplished in and through the historical Jesus according to the conventional teaching. And only when humans are redeemed can creation be saved. So humans come first, creation follows. And that, of course, is an approach that's being challenged widely today with our larger and bigger understanding of creation. And finally, all this can only be achieved in and through the Christian faith. Moving then into a wider perspective of things, we are invited to do so in this quotation from the theologian Elizabeth Johnson. Incarnation, she says, bespeaks a different form of divine presence marked by an unimaginable intensity of intimacy. That is a very profound statement that requires a lot of thought and reflection. It is the presence of the flesh, the Hebrew word bazar. And she goes on to explain that bazar applies not merely to human beings, it's a use of the word flesh that's applied to the whole of creation, the fleshiness of creation. Very different, she says, from the word sarx, used by St. Paul, which is usually flesh in more negative terms. The saving God became a human being who was part of our wider human community, which shares the membrane of life with other creatures, all made from cosmic material. In other words, we need to expand and extend our understanding of creation, or of incarnation, so that it embraces the wider reality of creation as we understand it today in the light of emerging science. Now, when it comes to the Christian story, we need to connect with our human story, which belongs primarily to Africa. And this little statement from the late Gregory Baum, the Canadian theologian, summarizes rather nicely the beginnings of this more expansive horizon. God is what happens to a person on the way to becoming human. Not on the way to becoming divine, but becoming human. But we have to understand human in that more integrated context of the wider creation. So 2 things about the African context. Africa is humanity's enduring home, which I explored in another YouTube, and it's where incarnation first took place in the sense of the embodiment of God in and through the human, because that's where we have been growing and evolving as a species for an estimated 7 million years. So we need to keep that context in mind. Traditionally, we associate incarnation very much with the land of Israel and what we call today the Holy Land. We have to widen the context and particularly embrace Africa, which is such a huge part of our evolving human story. Therefore, there are a few key concepts here that then we need to embrace and take on board. So, incarnation then understood in the evolutionary context. So God births forth and co-creates with human beings over a time span of 7 million years. So we've got to move beyond that very restrictive time limit of the 2,000 years. So many fundamental Christians, even to this day, think that nothing of importance happened before 2,000 years ago. It's a literalism that we apply to our scriptures, which does us a grave injustice, both to ourselves, to God, and to Jesus. Second, so firstly, in that first statement, the whole notion of a birthing God, a concept often used by the great mystics. Meister Eckhart, what does God do all day long? God lies on a maternity bed giving birth all day long. Now you see, if we had taken that metaphor in our Christian theology, instead of the metaphor of the ruling God, we'd have a totally different theology today. And a one that would actually be more congruent with our Christian faith and the understanding of the Gospels that's now emerging today. And this notion of we're co-creating with our God. And we meet that in other times when we look particularly at the notion of the kingdom of God. Then, secondly, God befriends us throughout our entire journey with the gift of empowering earthly grace. I do not call you servants, I call you friends. The befriending God. That's an adjective we need to use far more extensively in our Christian theology and in our discernment of Scripture. And with the notion of empowering, the God who's forever seeking to empower, and not this unfortunate preoccupation that we have had with kingly power in its association with God or with Jesus. And earthly grace, God's graciousness towards us is worked out in and through the context of our earthliness. Humans get it right, not perfect, for most of our grace-filled time on earth. Very difficult to accept that today in a world where we're obviously getting so many things wrong. But apparently for much, if not most, of our 7 million years, we did get it right. Why did we get it right? Because we remained very close to nature. And that is a major, major learning for our time. It's already obvious in the growing concern around ecology and environmental issues. It's beginning to come into our understanding of spirituality. We have got to incorporate it and integrate it into our theology as well. And that's a piece of work that's really only beginning. Humans evolve or develop grace-filled potentials through exploration, creativity, art, spirituality, ritual, chanting, music, mistakes also, and hopefully we learn from them, and then progress. Now all those items listed there, there's growing evidence for them through the field of paleontology, the study of human origins. Our ability particularly to respond and behave creatively is a major discovery today, throwing a whole new light on how we understand ourselves as a species and understand ourselves particularly from a spiritual and ethical point of view. And then finally, while humans live in a convivial relationship with the earth, we achieve our best. We are earthlings, that's how God created us. It's in and through the context of our earth and the wider creation that we need to rediscover and reclaim our true spiritual meaning. Moving on then, how then do we try to reinsert, as it were, the historical Jesus within that context is the challenge. So Jesus arrives at an axial time, at a millennial epoch. So the time around 2,000 years ago was considered to be one of these major evolutionary times. Now, how we understand axial time is a kind of a debatable issue. I tend to see it in a number of thousands of years rather than merely 1,500 years, which is the dates that Calvin Armstrong and other people use. But we don't need to go into that in detail for now. So, humanity seems around this time of 2,000 years ago to have reached a new level of evolutionary maturity. And it's within that context then that we begin to reframe, as it were, our understanding of Jesus. Therefore, and this is a very crucial sentence, in the coming of Jesus, God affirms, confirms, and celebrates all that humans have achieved in time. And it's happening in other religious contexts too, which I'll come back to in a moment. So these three words, to my mind, are absolutely central to an emerging theology of incarnation and of our Christian faith in the context of our world today. That being the case, Jesus does not come to rescue us from anything, because we got it right most of the time. And that poses enormous theological implications for the atonement theory, for our understandings of redemption, salvation, and so forth, which is work for another time. Jesus serves also as a bridge to our next evolutionary stage currently happening. And perhaps you can hear echoes of that in the priestly prayer of John's Gospel. It's important that I go away, the embodied historical Jesus, so that the Spirit can come to lead you into the fuller truth. Jesus is serving as a kind of a bridge to a further evolutionary expansiveness. What that might look like, we're only beginning to get a glimpse of it in the development of extrasensory perceptions and other abilities that some more gifted human beings around our planet are already beginning to develop. But the evidence for that is quite minimal as yet. And then finally, incarnation, therefore, is a task for us all to accomplish. And therefore, resurrection may be understood as the awakening of a new evolutionary threshold, not merely for Jesus, but for all of us. And again, the implications of that require a lot of unpacking, which is for another time. Moving on, therefore, we Christians are not the only ones that were around 2,000 years ago in this evolutionary epoch. The other major world religions were around too, or were beginning to evolve, or evolve more fully. And once we begin to take the evolutionary perspective, we must be very careful that we don't end up in a kind of a sectarian enclave, which unfortunately Christian theology has been in for a long time, claiming that we have something better and superior to all the others. It seems to me there are fairly obvious parallels in the other religions, showing that they too have a concept of incarnation. So the avatars of Hinduism, the bodhisattvas of Buddhism, the prophets in the case of the Islamic religion, the diviners in the case of the African religions, and then the shamans, if you want to, and shamanesses, if we had to go back into prehistoric times. Now, in all these examples, these are not gods, or they're not semi-divine beings, they're human beings, but considered to be so highly evolved that they serve as kind of models for the rest of us in the invitation into that fullness of life. And in terms of contemporary Christology, which of course is very controversial still in some circles, that's very much where we're also moving to. We've been over-preoccupied with the divinity of Jesus. It's the humanity of Jesus that we Christians need to come to terms with. It's that radical new way of being human, and particularly within the expansive horizons of creation. That's a journey, a kind of a pilgrimage, that we are really only beginning to enter into. And then these are some of the authors: Roger Haidt, the late Jacques Dupuy, and Michael Emeritus, who have been exploring this material. Unfortunately, in all cases, they have been challenged, and challenged unfairly, by the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. We now come to this quotation from the great Karl Rahner, in which he says, "Jesus must then be truly human, truly a part of the earth, truly a moment in the world's biological process of becoming, a moment in humanity's natural history." So if you notice the language he's using there, a moment in the world's biological process of becoming. All creation is integrated here. There are no echoes here of a dualistic split between sacred and secular. A moment in humanity's natural history, not just our supernatural history, but our natural one. It is perfectly legitimate to imply the notion of an event through which God's self-communication and acceptance reaches a point in history which is irrevocable and irreversible. And this quotation from John Shelby Spong then touches into the whole area where unfortunately we have been viewing things rather negatively, and this is an important corrective, and it's in that light I invite us to hear it. Atonement theology assumes that we were created in some kind of an original perfection. We now know that life has emerged from a single cell that evolved into self-conscious complexity over billions of years. There was no original perfection. It doesn't make sense in an evolutionary understanding of creation. Evolution is always evolving, changing, growing, developing, and making mistakes along the way, and hopefully we learn from them if we were in a more enlightened place. So there was no original perfection. So there could never have been a fall from perfection. What human life needs is not a theology of human degradation, and that's putting it rather bluntly, but I think it's a legitimate point, and it's a point we need to hear and wrestle with. That is what atonement theology gives us. What we need is a theology of human fulfillment, or maybe more accurately, human flourishing. It's a very rich quotation. It's very important as a dimension of this expansive understanding of incarnation that I am exploring. And then this quotation from Jeremy Rifkin from his book The Empathic Civilization, which really gets to the core of the matter here. He says, is it possible that human beings are not inherently evil, are intrinsically self-interested and materialistic, which is the whole moral basis on which we have built our Christian faith for many centuries, and indeed other religions have done the same, but are of a very different nature, an empathic one, and that all the other drives that we have considered to be primary, namely aggression, violence, selfish behavior, and acquisitiveness, are in fact drives that flow from the repression or denial of our most basic instinct. And for him, our most basic instinct is the desire to cooperate, the desire to work with, the desire to be a more egalitarian creative species when we remain very close to nature. And not merely, and this is the value of this quotation, and I think he's right, not merely has that been denied to us, it has been repressed. It has been driven down in a way that we have not been able to reconnect meaningfully. And religion, unfortunately, has played a major role in that rather negative and very dangerous and destructive repression. And so there's an enormous amount of healing that needs to be done in this whole area. This quotation from Peter Hodgson, he says, persons are not isolated but exist only in relation. Hence, it is not Jesus' isolated body that is significant, but his body interacting with other bodies. So what this theologian is touching into is, incarnation is primarily about embodiment. God works in and through bodies. You may recall that anecdote in the Gospels in which an evil spirit is driven out and goes around searching for another creature or reality to inhabit. The point there is, spirit can do nothing without body. It's in and through body that the power of spirit flourishes. And that's a key feature or dimension of our understanding of incarnation. And there are a number of theologians do acknowledge that. Unfortunately, they don't take the wider, bigger meaning of body, which the universe is a body, planet Earth is a body, trees are bodies. We're not the only creatures who are embodied in the web of life. The corporate body generated by Jesus, interacting with his contemporaries and with us, is the incarnation of the Christ Gestalt. So in other words, he's saying we shouldn't be viewing or understanding Jesus in a solely isolated human individual body. Now he's moving in here into what I call the anthropology of the Gospels, and this is another new area that has been poorly understood and that needs to be revisited and understood afresh. So this image that you're now looking at, you will recognize it fairly readily. I'm sure, is the disciples of John the Baptist coming to Jesus. John the Baptist has been put in prison, and they know he's going to be killed. And so they are searching either for a new leader or a new guru, or searching for maybe some bit of hope or meaning in the face of the terrible things happening. And the question they put to Jesus, I know it can be heard at a number of different levels, but I think one level it can be heard at, which has been largely neglected in the discernment of this particular scriptural passage, it can be heard at the level of an identity question. Who are you anyhow? What are you about? We want to know who you are. Now, if somebody asks you or me, who are you? I'm Diarmuid O'Murrochú. I'm a workshop facilitator. I'm a Christian theologian, whatever it might be. And you see, I point the hand towards myself. Note in the picture, the hand is pointing away from the individual. And so the disciples of John the Baptist must have been utterly baffled when Jesus gave this response. The response, as you recall, go and see what's happening. The blind see, the deaf hear, the dumb have their tongues released, and blessed are those who are not scandalized in me or through me. What Jesus seems to be saying is something like this. Don't be focusing on me, the individual, but engage first with the web of my relationships, and then come back and look at me. Now we're entering in here to a whole new way of understanding what it means to be human and what it means to be a person. So let's look at that very briefly. What kind of person was Jesus? And to understand the background to that, we need to look at the anthropology that was prevalent at the time, which was essentially a Greek Hellenistic anthropology promoted largely by Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. For Aristotle, these are some of the key features that make a person human. Autonomous. Each one of us stands on our own 2 feet, or we're mentor. Self-reliant. At the end of the day, you have all the resources within yourself to survive and to thrive. Separate. A rather innocent word with a rather dangerous meaning. For Aristotle, he was very preoccupied that humans were too enmeshed in nature. And therefore he wanted them to separate themselves from nature and stand over against it and away from it. Why? Because for Aristotle, we have souls. The trees don't have souls, according to him, nor the plants, nor the planet. He did concede that animals have a type of soul, but very inferior to that of humans. So that word separates there has a rather dangerous meaning. It goes against the whole grain of what we were as humans for most of our 7 million years. It goes against the whole grain of what our God intends us to be. Responsible, loving, integrated earthlings. The word rational, another very disturbing word in the way that Aristotle used it. Use the power of reason to work things out. He went on to say, men have that fully, and women don't have it at all. And thereby hangs a terrible gender injustice that prevails to our own time, and has never been openly confronted or contradicted, at least not in the Catholic Church, nor indeed in the other Christian churches either, to the best of my knowledge. And from that then we get the concept of the individual, which is a rather dysfunctional understanding, therefore, of the human person. So when Jesus speaks to the disciples of John and is quoting that phrase from the book of Isaiah, I suspect he's saying something very close to this. I am at all times the sum of my relationships, and that is what gives me identity. And if you don't understand the web of my relationships first, then you will not understand the full meaning of who I am and what I am as a human being. That's what's being said. Therefore, the distinctions of the language that we use, in talking this kind of language, people sometimes say to me, it sounds rather impersonal. For me, a personal relationship with Jesus is what's all important. And then I'm left wondering, what meaning of person are we using there? And are we not in great danger of projecting onto Jesus our understanding of personhood, which is essentially the Aristotelian one? I acknowledge it's the one that's being taught in our educational systems all over the world. It's the basis of our economics and of our politics today, but it's not what Jesus was about. Jesus was about an alternative anthropology and a whole new way of understanding the human that's much more congruent then with our emerging understanding of the created world. And it's a dimension of our Christian faith that we're only beginning to recognize and only beginning to reclaim. And it's a substantial piece of work waiting to be done. I'm only going to take the first part of this quotation from Sally MacFaig, which essentially is confirming what I've just been saying. Are we singular, independent, separate entities that end with our own skins? Or are we both formed and sustained by our radical interdependence with all other living creatures, as well as with the systems that maintain life? And of course she's saying, yes, we are, to the second part. Now, without going into a long elaboration of this, let me speak very briefly to this diagram here that you're looking at. It's borrowed largely from esoteric philosophy, and of course a lot of mainline churches and religions are totally dismissive of all that. My suggestion is, if you ever get a chance of having a conversation with an experienced healer that has a good reputation as an authentic healer, he or she will be the best person to explain this to you. Around each of our bodies are a number of energy fields. In esoteric philosophy they say 7, simply because it's a sacred number. The one closest to the body is the one we know something about, even though it has not really been studied scientifically, because it seems that mainline science and mainline medicine does not want to go there. It's called the aura. People who work in hospice and in hospice care, who of course are people with very fine, sensitive approaches, and have to be for that kind of work, will often tell you that when a person is dying, they can feel the energy evaporating. That's not some fantasy or wild imagination. In all probability, what they are experiencing, because we think it's what happens, is the energy fields are gradually evaporating or disappearing, until eventually all you're left with is the aura. That disappears, and then the person dies. Now, disappears is not really the appropriate word here. We know from standard physics that energy is never wasted or never destroyed. Energy is always transformed into other energy forms. So our beloved dead, those who have gone before us, are living all around us, and maybe right in here, at other energy levels. And that's what's going to happen to each one of us in and through our death. So that's one way of beginning to understand what we're talking about here. In this understanding of the relational modem of personhood, we are relational beings interconnecting with the relational universe. And then finally, still staying with this diagram, you look at me therefore, Diarmuid Ó Murchú, and you tend to judge me by my body's size and shape, or you tend to perceive me. But in actual fact, the real Diarmuid Ó Murchú is this, not this. Because without those energy fields, I would not even exist. Therefore, I am a relational creature, at all times intimately interconnected with the relational universe, and without that I could not survive, never mind thrive. And that, it seems, is what Jesus was actually saying to the disciples of John. So there is that whole new relational anthropology at the heart of our faith as a Christian people that we've got to come to terms with, integrate and embrace. And so we come then to, I'm beginning to move into my conclusion now, and this is a sort of a resume of how we then understand incarnation today, and in its context also linked in with the great human story of the 7 million years. In freedom to birth the future that is most wholesome for the nature that has birthed us. And that's, see how the quotation stays with the nature, with the natural. Because it's only in and through the natural that we can hope to realize anything of what we call the supernatural. The nature that is not only our genetic heritage, but also the entire human community and the evolutionary and ecological reality in which we belong. And it's our belonging to it that's all important. Not our domination over it, or not our way of manipulating it as if it were all some kind of a commodity. Exercising this agency is said to be God's will for humans. And so therefore I come then to the final slide, and that lovely quotation from Marianne Williamson, often used in the context of Nelson Mandela, but he actually borrowed it from her. And this then gives us, as it were, a set of signposts that we can adopt in moving forward as we're called to embrace this wider and deeper understanding of incarnation. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. And that's because the light element of our lives has been grossly neglected through our spirituality and through the kind of negative approach to our faith used over several centuries. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us and around us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we make our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. And that's a nice kind of personal way, and perhaps a more down-to-earth way of inviting us to the challenge that faces us as a Christian people. This concluding quotation from Richard Rohr throws the invitation at us in a kind of an almost blunt sentence, but indeed a very beautiful sentence. We are all part of a great parade about which we know little, it seems. And now, in this world of mass information, there is a huge challenge to all of us to become more acquainted with our faith in its deeper sense, in its wider sense, in its larger embrace. The essential gospel has not been proclaimed very well, that's for sure. We prefer to doubt about Jesus' incarnation and our own. It is frankly just too much.